Hello, everyone, and we are live with USC's Advanced Games Business class taught by Ed Zobrist. We have a super interesting panel today to talk about the future of free-to-play game monetization. And joining us today, we have three really great speakers. First, we have games industry investment analyst and Deconstructor of Fun This Week in Games podcast host, Eric Kress. Eric is a principal at Gossamer Consulting. Also, Eric worked at EA and Kabam and will be representing the perspective of someone with experience coming from whale-based game monetization. So this would include monetization schemes that many traditional Western players would potentially consider predatory. Next, we have Tim Morten, probably best known for his work on Starcraft 2 at Blizzard, but who has also worked at Electronic Arts, Santa Monica Studios, amongst other game companies. Tim is currently production director and CEO at Frost Giant, working on a new free-to-play RTS game called Stormgate, which some have likened to be the spiritual successor to Starcraft. And Stormgate will need to navigate free-to-play monetization for an audience who may be unaccustomed to free-to-play monetization practices, and particularly things like gotcha loot boxes and pay-to-win mechanics. I don't know if you do that, Tim, but we can get into that. And finally, our third speaker is Ed Zobrist, who not only teaches this USC class, but was formerly head of publishing at Epic Games, where he led all of the IP integrations for Fortnite while he was there. Ed has also had a very distinguished game industry career working at other game companies, including RockU, Sierra Online, Vivendi Universal, and Mattel. And since Ed worked on games like Fortnite, which have friendlier monetization, it'd be great to also get your perspective on these kind of monetization practices. And finally, I am Joseph Kim, your moderator. I produce the Gamemakers podcast. I'm also the CEO of Lila Games, and we are a free-to-play game studios working on a shooter game. And currently, like Tim, we are in the process of designing our monetization strategy. And just to provide a little bit of additional context, I also have a long history in gaming, but from more of the free-to-play, the kind of predatory free-to-play monetization context. So I worked on a game called King of Avalon, billion-dollar life of product game in 4X. And 4X, for some of you who don't know, generally perceived to have some of the most aggressive and what may be called predatory monetization in the games industry. Now, I don't ever want to do that again, so I'm not doing that, but I could potentially provide some perspective from that kind of a background as well. And all right, so before diving into our discussion, for any of our speakers here today, anything else you want to add in terms of intros or any context that I may have missed for our audience?
Yeah, I want to add just one bit. We actually have a fifth participant, which is my class. So I'm going to show you guys what that's like. Yeah,
what's up, USC?
Hello.
Congrats on football coming back.
We lost last week.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's true.
And I also want to start with a little shout out to the other two guests for whom it's the first time I've met Tim and Eric, even virtually. But Tim, I followed you for a long time for your career at Blizzard. Just amazing, and also amazing was your last podcast. I'm going to give a shout out for those who want to look at a really interesting podcast. Tim did one last week with Navik, which I consider to be my favorite podcast of the year because it was so insightful. So thank you, Tim. And Mr. Kress, I'm a huge fan, been lurking on Deconstructor of Fun for several years. Man, not only you're bright, I just have to admire how the courage to be as bluntly outspoken as you are, because so people are so hesitant in the industry, and I just think it really helps us a lot. 98% of the time, I agree with you, Eric. 2% of the time, not so much. Maybe this meeting will have some of that 2% because those tend to be the most interesting podcasts. You're muted.
You're muted, Eric.
98 is still an A+, right? So I'm good at USC. No, I really do enjoy doing the Deconstructor of Fun podcast. I think it gives me an opportunity to voice some of what really is going on behind the scenes with some of these acquisitions, some of the business practices, Apple's malfeasance, like all these things that are happening that people don't talk about because they're afraid of getting fired or getting blacklisted, but I don't really care because I'm old and I do my own thing. So I'm 51, right? Whatever. Retiring soon, so I can be as brazen as I want.
All right. Well, guys, let's kick this off. And I thought we could tee up further discussion by just getting an on-the-ground, real-world scenario of developing a free-to-play monetization strategy. And also, in addition, just getting an understanding of player reaction to free-to-play monetization. And I know, Tim, I mentioned during your intro that Frost Giant recently announced Stormgate, which, for someone like me was amazingly great news. I'm a super RTS fan, but I was a little bit surprised when I went to see the game trailer. I checked out some of the Twitter and other comments from various places. I noticed some, and to be clear, not all, but there are some negative comments from players when they realized that Stormgate would be free to play. I mean, I don't think you even mentioned anything else about the monetization strategy, just like it's free to play. And then there was all this hand wringing, right? So my question for you is, first of all, why did you decide on a free to play model? And understood, there was a free to play model before with Starcraft and things like that. But just kind of your thoughts in terms of how you're currently thinking about the monetization strategy for Stormgate.
Absolutely. And I'll be upfront that I was originally somewhat negative on free to play as a business model early on. I think, I was at Electronic Arts working on a Command and Conquer sequel, and we got hard pivoted to free to play. Team didn't want to do it, but we got hard pivoted to free to play. And so I had to spend some time out there playing free to play games to really understand what I felt was good and what wasn't good. And I'll say that audience was when they found out that we were going free to play with that game, also fairly negative about it. And I believe that some of this derives from frustration mechanics, like grind mechanics. Some of it, you used the word predatory earlier, but there are some monetization practices in mobile free to play that for core gamers just don't feel good when we're used to being able to get everything for a fixed amount of money. But it was so fascinating for me then years later, having gone through that initial learning process and thought exercise of how to adapt a core game to free to play, being at Blizzard working on StarCraft 2, where the audience was actually asking for free to play. And the reason they were asking was that they loved that game and they wanted to see a bigger audience for the game. And one of the clear barriers to entry was this perception that you had to spend not just on the base game, but also the latest expansions to catch up to where the game was, and that cost of entry was such a high barrier. StarCraft 2 is an esport, and so we even had partners on the esports side saying to us, hey man, look at the top 10 free-to-play games. Most of them are top 10 free-to-play. Top 10 esport games, most of them are free-to-play. That was thought-provoking to us, especially that the audience themselves were asking for this. And so we went through a process of thinking about, all right, let's forget about how free-to-play has been approached on the mobile side. Let's try to think about what actually feels good for players, but still works from a cash flow perspective to make the team be able to keep working on the game. Because of course, nobody wins if we just give everything away and there's no ongoing revenue to support development. So anyhow, I just wanted to bring up those two experiences because they were really formative for me, having gone through one audience that was very resistant and then another audience that was actually asking for free to play. And I could obviously go much deeper on decisions we made and how all of that went. But, I think a lot of it starts from what are the preconceptions that we have about the business model.
Okay. And have you figured out exactly what that free-to-play monetization model looks like right now? Are you guys still working on that?
For Stormgate, we're very much drawing on the learnings from StarCraft 2. We did get a positive response to decisions that we made on StarCraft 2, avoiding grind mechanics, avoiding pay to win, trying to stay very focused on giving players an opportunity to try each type of content. And if they like that content, giving them the option to a la carte buy more of that content type. That's kind of the philosophy behind it. So where before you're forced to spend $50, $60, $70 and you're not necessarily going to consume all that content, now we are a la carting it, but we're providing an opportunity for you to go deeper on the type of content that you enjoy spending.
Got it. And before kicking over to Eric and Ed, maybe I can also like dive a little deeper into, I think the bigger, the more, the word that's even worse than free to play for a lot of players is pay to win. So could you, in your definition, what does pay to win mean?
If any benefit from a game balance perspective is conferred to a player by nature of how much they've spent, there's a perception that that's pay to win. So if it's buying a more powerful unit or buying powers for a unit, buying gold ammo is something that some games do, just anything that confers a benefit on the basis of money. I think it's accepted that you can have cosmetics that don't impact game balance. You can accelerate progress through a game. Like there are all kinds of things that are not considered pay to win, but anything that affects game balance is.
Right. And so Eric or Ed, either of you guys, maybe you can jump in, both Tim and my studio as well, as we're trying to develop our free-to-play monetization strategies. How would you guys react, or what advice would you give about how we should be thinking about a free-to-play monetization strategy, and maybe even this pay-to-win issue in particular?
You want me to go first, Eric?
Go for it, Ed.
I'll go first. I think a lot of this depends on who you are. The way I perceive it is there's a spectrum of games that are successful. And I'm not making value judgments about ones that tend to be more on the predatory side. They're struggling. They're trying to minimize their risk. They're going after tried and true models. So they have their own business model. If they want to follow that, they can follow that. I'm just saying at the other end, there are some companies that are not as risk averse, that will be less predatory, more friendly in the models. And it's not just monetization, you're right. It could be in other ways, in terms of they tend to be cosmetic driven. As Tim pointed out, they tend not to be grind mechanics where you're paying to get over a bunch of grind, which you otherwise would have needed to have done. It also means you tend not to have really high prices because you're not as well driven. You tend not to have a lot of RNG, a lot of randomness going on. So that just straight up fair in how it goes. But my only point is I just think there's a spectrum of companies that is according to that company's profile, they're choosing where on that spectrum they want to insert themselves and participate, and they can all work. But I think the smaller companies that don't have the risk profile of the balance sheet, it's a little more dangerous to go after these less, these more friendly mechanics that I laid out. It's more easily fit into a spreadsheet you can show your investors when you do something that's far more on the geared towards optimizing, like an LTV.
Yeah, I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. This is a very complex topic, so covering it in like a quick, couple minutes is not really doing it service, but I will try my best. So historically, mobile has really delved into the free-to-play market, and so most of those monetization methods are very predatory, very very high LTV, focusing on whale-driven economies. And that has been translated over to console and PC, as of late. Now, there are other exceptions to this, League of Legends and others, but most of the early successes on console have been predatory in nature. So FIFA, Madden, NBA 2K are all pay to win, or pay to progress is the other way of expressing it as well, where you're getting advantage by spending money, building your best team possible, right, for thousands of dollars, right, on FIFA, for instance. So until Fortnite came along and the Battle Pass system started coming out, that is less predatory, and probably not predatory as much, but it's predatory in different ways, I would argue. But that is also a debate that's gone on for a while. I have children that are 11 that spend all this crazy money on skins, like a banana. Like, is that really worth $30, right? Or you just basically trying to keep up with your friends, right? Keep up with the Joneses type thing. Is that predatory? I don't know. You decide, right? But it's certainly not pay to win. So anyway, so it's been evolving since then, and the next generation of console and PC games are trying to figure out success in free to play, and we're seeing successes along the way. GTA is a cosmetic economy, and so is similar to Fortnite, but in a different execution. Tim is actually trying something that hasn't really had success yet, where it's more free to try, and then pay to continue to play at, whatever thing that you want to do. There haven't been as many success stories, and I'd like to ask, that's my first question to Tim, is like, what are you modeling it after? Any games that are out there that I'm not thinking about? But that's how things are evolving. But the last thing I'll say before I go, to put it in perspective, when you talk about pay to win, it's basically every game out there on mobile, basically, except for some of the cosmetic stuff like Call of Duty, et cetera. But that's like almost probably 95% of the revenue generated from the App Store is probably from pay to win or pay to progress type economies. So that is the model that has been proven to work with, driving whales to spend insane amounts of money. And that's across every genre, including puzzle for that matter, social casino, strategy, RPG, all the genres are primarily pay to win, pay to progress. So.
Yeah. So one of the things you brought up there was just the question of what I'm basing our thinking on for Stormgate. And so I had this experience in 2017 of pivoting Starcraft 2 from kind of traditional premium model to free to play. And when we did that, we designed it in such a way that we were trying to protect revenue. So, we were trying not to incur a big hit to the tail revenue that we were seeing for that game. And it's kind of an interesting scenario, maybe akin to MMOs that changed their business model late in the life cycle, in that the player base you've got at that point is highly engaged. So, they're kind of your most committed players, and you can count on them to continue to invest because this game is like their primary hobby. So if you're giving them some more content, even if it's micro content, like there's a reasonable expectation they're going to buy it. So we're trying to maintain revenue, but what we were hoping to see was a significant increase in player counts, and our lots of ways to measure that, whether it's concurrency, monthly actives. I think MAUs, monthly actives, were the most common metric that we used there. But we saw a massive increase in transitioning from premium model to free to play. And it really supported that hypothesis that, again, came to us from the community, that if the game were free, a lot more people would come play it. We did see a slight drop in revenue in as much as there was some content that before we had charged for, like namely the first campaign, that we decided to just completely give away as an incentive to bring players into the game. And so we kind of knew that going in, that we'd see a little bit of a dip from that, but because of more people coming through the funnel, we had other micro content, including campaign content, for them to attach to. And so, there was some, at least initial lift when we went free to play based on that. All of this to say, I had the benefit of seeing how that audience reacted to that transition for Starcraft going free to play. And so for Stormgate, we're basing our thinking on that. I think there are opportunities to do better in terms of providing more content, more variety of content, more regular content. But the basic model was validated from that initial experience.
Okay, and maybe the topic that we can go into a little bit more deeply is this notion of what is predatory monetization. And so kind of like one way that I think about it is, like, to your point, Eric, if 95% of monetization in free-to-play is pay-to-win, I would say the non-pay-to-win stuff would be, as you mentioned, cosmetics or content locking to some degree, or content unlocking if you pay. But, when
we say 95%, I think it's just mobile. It's not true.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Mobile. Yeah. So overall, and yeah, I think you probably, some of the Fortnite numbers were publicly
Fortnite numbers, league numbers, Fortnite numbers and league numbers, they quash a lot of these mobile numbers.
That's true.
But League of Legends is pay to win by some measures, right? In terms of access to new characters that change the meta.
You can earn those champions over time. You could.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make some argument in terms of like runes and stuff like that, but I think that you can still grind for that stuff, right? So
I'll capitulate. I'll capitulate that Riot does a good job in terms of balancing that stuff out. So yeah. And that's PC, right? That's not even console. That's
Correct,
only PC.
right.
yeah,
Right.
well,
And by the way,
yeah.
I mean, Fortnite was a #1 mobile game for many, many weeks when it came out. And, you know, it was never outside the top 10 before it left the store. So it was monetarily certainly in the running with all the other mobile games.
But it's mice nuts in mobile though. Like it's tiny.
A
Like
top 10 game.
shooters.
Mice nuts.
Yeah, shooters are tiny in mobile. They're like 5% of the market.
I'm saying it was a top 10 of all games in mobile.
But again, it's relative to mobile. The shooter genre is a tiny, right? Compared
No, I'm
to
talking
puzzle.
compared to puzzle, compared to Clash. Fortnite was a top 10 game of all categories, not
No,
just.
I'm saying the category itself on a yearly basis is less than 5% of the overall mobile game market in the West, right? And less in Asia as well. So what I'm saying is that market represents a very tiny sliver of the overall market for games, despite Fortnite's success during its heyday, right? It's just a very small genre. So it's not indicative of what makes money on mobile, nor is it indicative of what is, well, it could be indicative of what's to come, but it's certainly not indicative of what is making money on mobile.
Well, what would you consider what you're the ones that are making the money on mobile?
There's only 3 genres that make money on mobile at scale. It's basically
what are the games?
Well, Candy Crush, any puzzle game.
Fortnite was within striking distance of Candy Crush. They're all in the top 5.
Well, the numbers are not suggesting what you're suggesting. So anyway, but the puzzle strategy games,
Machine Zone. AI, go look it up, Eric.
I'll go. I have it. I'm looking right here now. I'll tell you. As a percentage, it's very small, 5%. So.
I'm talking about the rankings. If you're talking about how it ranked among other,
it doesn't matter. Rankings don't matter. It's all about revenue.
But companies are going to make their decisions on basis of games. They're not going to make decisions based on the gallery.
Right. But see, this is the danger, the fallacy of making games in this market, particularly and this is what I fight all the time, working at Warner, working at Fun Plus, working at Kabam, is that people are designing games that they want to make, but not the games that actually really make money on mobile. And no offense to Joseph Kim or my co-host Mishka, is like building a shooting game on mobile right now is going to be a really, really, really hard struggle to get any type of market share because it's dominated by 2 or 3 games that take up 80 or 90% of the market, which is very small to begin with. So understanding that dynamic and what the market opportunity, your total addressable market is critical in the success of building games for the market. Now, I know Joseph is trying to innovate and do something new with the shooter genre, and I am actually 100% supportive of building more casual games, but the shooter genre in general is pretty impacted.
Yeah, I don't disagree that it's not a super hard problem. I agree with that for sure. But maybe in terms of and it'd be interesting to get, Tim and Ed, your perspective on, Eric and I coming from more of the more pay to win type of environment. What would you guys consider predatory from like a pay to win perspective? And maybe like the one way that I kind of think about it is really from the perspective of like the relative conversion of your audience in the ARPU. And usually what happens is when you have games that only convert a small amount of your audience, then you have to convert them at higher ARPU, meaning average revenue per paying user. So like if the players are having, if the players that actually do spend, because there's such a small percentage, if they're having to spend thousands of dollars for your game to be successful, and then the mechanics that you introduce into the game are generally the kind of mechanics that are very compulsive in nature, that may be very frustrating and grindy and things like that. And so like I don't know how you guys think about it, but are there specific mechanics or do you look at like certain metrics or KPIs to indicate whether a game is predatory or not? Or would you guys just consider anything in which you're getting an advantage in a game to not be a good form of free-to-play monetization?
Yeah, I guess from my side, anything that confers a gameplay advantage, I believe will be perceived by the audience as pay to win, and ultimately it's their perception that matters. Certainly there are games out there, and I'll call out Diablo Immortal as an example, that have a reputation as not being ideal from a monetization perspective, but that are still seemingly financially succeeding. So, I think there's a decision for all of us to make. Definitely the Frost Giant decision is that we do not want to be pay to win, and we don't want to have a business model that's perceived as exploiting consumers. Like we want to be as player friendly as we possibly can. But other companies out there are making money, making different decisions, I guess. So it's worth calling that out at least.
Sure. Buying power is the obvious one. I think there's a lot of nuance around loot boxes. Is it taking advantage or exploiting addictive behavior for how they're doing it? That's another one that I think is sort of on the spectrum. Depends on the kind of company you are and what sort of values you've adopted. At Epic, that's a place where Epic won't go, but obviously a lot of other companies go there, and I think FIFA does it very well.
Yeah, maybe the one other thing we could talk about are also this potential difference between, because it seems like we are taking kind of a Western perspective when we talk about the aggressiveness of monetization, but to some degree, and some of I spent time in China working and developing a game in China, and to some degree, some of the Asian audience almost expects, like, if I'm paying, why am I not getting an advantage, right? Or and things like that. So do you guys consider geography or even demographics? Because it also seems like the younger generation, Gen Z, might be, although I would say a lot of Gen Z people that I talk to also talk about like an aversion to pay to win, but at the same time, like the willingness to spend in free-to-play types of games. I think my 8-year-old daughter has spent like $250 in Adopt Me on Roblox already. But what do you guys think about differences with respect to geography or demographics or audience and things like that?
I'll take a crack at this one really
Sure.
quickly.
Please.
Well, according to this Sensor Tower, worldwide, it was 1%. 1.9% of the overall market was Fortnite in 2018 for mobile.
In what year?
2018.
2018?
Yeah.
If you look,
you can confirm it on your sources. I'm telling you, I've been doing this, looking at this stuff a lot.
I'm telling you, Sensor Tower is wrong. I'm telling you that because of the Apple Google lawsuits, we had to disclose a lot of information. Go look it up, Eric.
No, apples to apples. Anyway,
I'm talking about
right.
real numbers versus Sensor Tower guessing what they are.
Well, they guess for everything.
Well, these are real numbers, though.
Again, it's small in the overall scheme of things. Okay. Predatory. Okay, so the difference between Western markets and Asian markets is actually the conversion rate. So in the US market, the rule of thumb is you get this is mobile only, right? Fortnite is completely different, as is Riot. They actually have conversion rates in the teens and maybe higher, depending on how you cut it, right? But in the West, mobile gets around 3 to 4% max in terms of overall conversion, right? Of that 3 to 4%, the top 5% can represent as high as 60 to 70% of the revenue. So a fraction of the percent of people that are playing your game or downloading your game make 60 to 70% of the revenue. And because of that, for the last 8 years, we've been doing UA optimization, monetization optimization to go after those whales, right? To basically target them with the deepest monetary spend possible, which creates this predatory type design in all games that are out on mobile, right? No matter what game it is, really. Even puzzle games, they're a little bit better. They open up it a little bit in terms of monetization, in terms of conversion. The difference is that in Japan and Korea and China to a lesser degree, but Japan and Korea specifically, the conversion rates are much higher. They can approach 10, maybe 12%. Joseph, you can probably correct me if I'm off a little bit. And on top of that, these guys spend insane amounts of money. They have no issue with spending money on pay to win, right? And so it's like a double whammy there. And so they spend insane, like drunken sailors on these games, and it's culturally acceptable relative to what it's like in the West. So it's a completely different market. Those designs sometimes work, sometimes don't work in the West. People have used a lot of those designs in the West and tried to like gotcha and other mechanics. But because the conversion rates are so low in the West, it's still focused on a very small percentage of the overall audience. So that's the kind of dynamic we've been solving for the last 8 years. And having said that, and we'll probably talk about this later, because of changes with the privacy laws that Apple's done and what Google might have done, the actually landscape may change, and it may actually create the need to create more player-friendly and less predatory type monetization practices, because you can't target those whales the way you have in the past. So I'll leave it at that. But that's the kind of way I look at it. And if you look at those numbers, the way people monetize in the West, you have to design them in that particular way to be successful for most games or most genres.
Yeah, I think you're mentioning an important point, Eric, in terms of like the ability to target whales, at least before was there, now that we can't. And I think on top of that, if we were to add in, for example, the current macro economy, right? Like we're in a recession. I'm not sure. I mean, whales, the super rich are going to continue to spend, but there are certainly some players who won't be able to spend as much. And so I would say on the PC side, fixed price games represent a massive, deal in terms of entertainment. So I agree with you that I think monetization behavior will favor games with to the model that I spoke about before, lower ARPU, higher conversion, rather than the low conversion, higher ARPU. But maybe one question I can ask you, Tim, is like talking about audiences and whether it's demographic or geographic or whatever. I mean, your game comes with like almost an audience built in, an RTS audience. And so when you think about monetization, like if you were to build a different game, would that have changed your monetization strategy, or is it based upon is some of your monetization strategy today based upon the fact that you've got like an existing audience that's going to be looking for your game?
Good question. I would say there's a core philosophy on our side that the most important thing is player happiness. And so if we're building something that they enjoy, that has long-term reward for them, just in terms of, they're getting better at the game, it's a social experience, it's bringing them joy. Like it's sort of like the old, when Facebook was first building scale, that I think when you have an audience, you can figure out how to make the business work. But the most important first thing is getting that audience. So you're right, we do have a built-in audience. I think the standards for success have changed since 10 years ago, well, longer than 10 years now, since Starcraft 2 came out. So we really do need to reach more than just the core audience, but we absolutely fervently believe that the most important audience for us to win over is that core audience, because they'll be the evangelists that kind of make or break our success. And so if we do something that they don't like, we're dead. So you're right. We're very much thinking about how will our current audience react? How will the current RTS audience react to the monetization techniques that we employ? But we are also thinking about, all of those things about lowering the barrier to entry, bringing more people in. How do we improve the retention of those new players? There are a lot of dynamics for us to think about along those lines. I was going to go back to something you said earlier, though, Joe, about other markets, or perhaps even other age demographics, having an expectation of being able to pay to win. I thought that was a thought-provoking question. I think for us, because we're coming from a place that was traditionally premium and they didn't have the ability to pay to win, and yet, China was one of the biggest markets, certainly for Starcraft 2, but also Warcraft 3, even before the remake. There was just a huge population of players in China. So I want to believe that that's not a requirement, like that we don't have to provide pay to win, but I don't know. I would turn that question on you and the others. Do you think that is true? Do you think there are markets where there's a baseline expectation that you have to be pay to win, or else they'll reject your game?
I would say it a little differently, too. I think there are certain markets, and I think Korea and China are two of them, where they're just more accepting of it. It's not a requirement of it, but they're more accepting of the idea than I think Western audiences are.
Yeah, maybe one other bit of context that I could provide. And this is just my theory, but I do have a theory around monetization in Asian cultures and China in particular, right? Because I think in the West, and this has to do more with like a peacocking effect, meaning that in the West, a lot of people, I think there's a latent human desire to kind of show off, right? And so in the West, it's like, hey, look at my car, look at my house. Let me invite you over to my house and show off, right? But in China, like people are generally at work. And so like the thing that you show off is not your house, not your car, but it's your phone, right? Because you're at work, you're hanging out with people. Look at my latest iPad or iPhone. And then also within the game itself, I think that some of these Chinese companies have provided ways that you can peacock within the game itself. And so, one of the first times I was in China, my friend was showing me this game, and he's showing me this game where I'm not sure how real it was, but he said that there was a $10,000 building that you could buy. And then there were all these people, I think it was through an integration with WeChat or whatever. He was getting messages from like all of these girls because you can kind of show off what you've bought in a game and things like that, right? So I think that there's also this effect of not just pay to win, but like pay to peacock, pay to be able to show off that, I'm a rich guy, I'm important, things like that. So I think that, at least in my theory, is another dynamic which probably doesn't exist in the West, but sort of exists potentially in China.
But it does exist in Fortnite, right? Isn't that the only purpose of Fortnite, is to peacock, right? To show off all your skins to your friends and to show how much collection you've done.
Is that the basis of cosmetics?
Yeah, or GTA. I mean, GTA is the worst, right? How many cars can I own? How many boats can I own? How many hookers can I have?
That's true.
How many? What's my harem look like? No, I'm exaggerating, but like, yeah, that's all peacocking for friends that you play online with, right? And then for games like World of Warcraft, right, it's about achieving those things in the game, right? It's not about buying them. I mean, you can buy some things, you can buy some mounts that give you the peacock thing, but actually World of Warcraft's done a really, well, depending on who you talk to, right? If you're Activision, you think they've done a terrible job of monetizing World of Warcraft. If you're a World of Warcraft player, you think they've been, pretty good about it. So anyway, I think those games have shown that peacocking is alive and well, particularly with that demo.
I think it's also a function of, is it multiplayer not? Is it social not? The more social is, the more you'd expect that kind of behavior.
Sure.
The less social, you don't really care.
Yeah, I mean, but if we talk about, we're not going to get into the metaverse stuff, but when we start talking about those type of designs, where you're going to be able to share different items and stuff like that, that kind of thing, collecting becomes even more and more likely to be more and more prevalent in these games. So as they design it, as we move forward.
All right. Well, Ed, I know we're running a little long here, so maybe I could ask one last question here, because we want to be able to open it up to Q&A for the audience. But in terms of like, I wanted to ask a question around the way that you should be thinking about the business implications of your free-to-play model. And I don't know if Eric, you want to weigh in on this, but like when it comes to specific metrics or, how you think about the business implications of the free-to-play model, how do you think about it? Are you looking for specific, you mentioned conversion rates and things like that for Chinese games, but what do you look for, or how would you define success for a free-to-play monetization model based upon how you're thinking about the business?
I mean, I don't think the metrics necessarily change. It's just a question of how they kind of interact with each other. So the three metrics that we always think about is retention, day 7, day 30, or day 1, day 7, day 30, right? How long do they stick around? How much do they spend, per day or per 7 day, per 30 day or whatever. Sorry, whether they convert and then how much they spend, right? And so if you're building a game that has less monetization or less egregious monetization, you're going to need that conversion to go up like dramatically, right, in order to be whole. Or in the case of something like Fortnite or Call of Duty, you're just going to need a really, really big audience, that can spend it. You get better conversion, but you also drive revenue with lower spend by having a ton of people, right? So those are always the metrics that you're looking at. It's just a question of how they interact with one another, right? To get away from the 3%, 60, 70% of the top 1%, that spend, that. So I guess those are the metrics that you're always looking at.
Ed, any thoughts, or
Yeah,
Tim, do you? Or go ahead.
Eric, this is largely a business model, which if you move one lever in one part of the model, you need to move another lever in another part of the model to make it work. And there's a lot of different levers going on. That's what I'm saying. I think it's just a huge spectrum out there as far as to what degree certain companies are more or less player friendly, of which monetization is one aspect of being player friendly. I think that, in fact, that one of the reasons that made me think about this particular podcast was it's hard to judge player satisfaction with how player friendly, say, a publisher is being, other than maybe a version of retention being a way that's expressed. And I think that some of these games, like we talk about League, we talk about Fortnite, we talk about Pokemon Go, and I'm not representing Epic or representing Fortnite in this sense, but my sense is, having been around some of those games, that the audience sort of recognizes that they're not being manipulated, that they're not being preyed upon for it, and they react a little more kindly to their participation in the game than other games where they're so clearly being leveraged for money constantly. A friend of mine once said it's sort of like at some point the players eventually see the matrix and they drop off and they realize how they're being manipulated by the companies.
That's a great comment. It kind of goes back to something Joe said earlier about, styles of games that can get more players spending than the traditional kind of whale-based thinking. And I think, going back to my limited experience on this stuff from the real-time strategy side of the world, that's such an engaged audience. Indeed, the behavior that we saw is that more of them are willing to spend, and that we didn't have to engineer something that was as well-based as mobile economies. And I wonder how much of what Ed just described, that, kind of transparently, we were trying to create a friendlier environment, encourage that. It feels like there's room to explore and perhaps innovate there for other companies, as well as free-to-play as a business model matures, and as we see it get adapted for PC traditional core audiences, for console traditional core audiences, and even mobile, I would argue, is kind of going more core with the kinds of games that are being produced there. I think we've all kind of accepted that whale style spending is just the way free to play works. But I wonder if there's more room to innovate there.
Right. And maybe I could give a few thoughts in terms of, some of the ways in which I kind of think about the monetization from a business perspective. Certainly some of the things that Eric mentioned in terms of those metrics around retention, monetization based upon a day, so your ARPU curve. But also, as I mentioned, our ARPU relative to conversion, also pair buckets. Like sometimes what you'll see are clusters of players that eventually start clustering around specific amounts of aggregate spend over a period of time. And so if you have pairs that are way too high in terms of pair buckets, if you're, for simplification, if you're saying $10, $100, $1,000, $10,000 and bigger, right? For your audience, where are the pairs clustering around? And then maybe you need to shift that up or down to be friendly or not. And then maybe the one other framework that I can describe is one around thinking about whether you're optimizing payment on what's called the front end or the back end, meaning the front end being this concept around willingness to pay. So, and I think this is probably more, Tim, your strategy, which is making a game so fun, or the right strategy, that whatever you're selling, even if it doesn't make any sense, your players are just going to buy it because they have engaged with your game so much, and they have so much value that the pink bunny suit, even though it doesn't make any sense, they're like, I've played this game so much, I want to support the devs. I'll spend whatever for this stupid thing that doesn't even make sense. And then on the back end is, what I'm more used to, the payment optimization. How do we look at the analytics, and how do we create mechanics in such a way to really squeeze as much money from players as possible. And so I do think that in this new world, to Eric's point before about IDFA deprecation and targeting, that the shift is going to have to be more towards willingness to pay. We're shifting in that direction from payment optimization. All right. Go ahead.
One final word, and just to do the math real quick, is that when you're talking about 20 million downloads, you have 800,000 spenders at 4% conversion. You have 40,000 people of the 20 million that represent 60 to 70% of your revenue. And if you're doing like a 20 times 20 LTV, let's say, 20, which is really high, don't get me wrong, it's really high. That means that these spenders are spending an average of $10,000 on your game, right? That's what we're an average. Some are spending 100,000. So in order to really replicate that kind of success of a game, you need to convert a lot of freaking people at lower values, right? To spend that much money. And so that's how the math works. And that's what you're trying to optimize around. And that's the way I think you should think about it in terms of what it's going to require to get away from these whale economies. And then obviously the design features that allow people or make people want to spend is what is absolutely critical. And I'm hoping that Tim can figure it out, because that's what we need to see.
Yeah, I'll definitely be there to try it out, Tim. But all right, so unless there are any other final comments or thoughts, Ed or Tim, we could shift to Q&A. Any final thoughts or comments?
No, my only one final one is, I think Harbinger might be going for subscription services or game passes. And I think that if those sorts of subscription services ever got large scale traction, it's going to favor the companies that are obviously retention focused, not the companies that are focused on.
Do you mean subscription services in game or as
No,
like a game? Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
So 10 years from now, that's dominating the marketplace. We're going to be more towards retention oriented companies.
Oh, heaven help us.
I'm not saying it's great from a business standpoint, Eric.
It's not good. It's not good for any independents at all. It's only good for the platform holders.
This could be the whole next podcast.
Yeah, you want to, let's go. Let's go. I've been talking about this forever.
All right, guys. So that's the end of this portion of the session.
Yep.
Take us over to Q&A.
I'll cue them up for the Q&A. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking around for this.